Do you think you really know the 1970s? Even if you lived through the decade, there are probably some forgotten historical moments and retro pop culture trends that will surprise you. In today's video, we're taking a deep dive into the 70s time capsule with the Memory Traveler to uncover 15 facts and fads that you may not remember or never knew about in the first place. Rotary dial phones. If you grew up after the 70s, you probably have little to no experience with rotary phones and their retro dialing technology. Rotary phones worked by sending pulses to the telephone exchange each time you rotated the dial to input a number. Touch-tone push-button phones didn't become widespread until the 1980s and 90s. Can you imagine having to manually spin a dial around just to make a call? It seems archaic compared to instantly pressing buttons and touchscreens now. But winding a rotary phone dial was simply the way it was done in the 1970s and prior decades. Very few people had push-button phones in their homes yet. The rotary phone was the hallmark way of communicating. Disco music and culture defined the decade with stars like the Bee Gees and Donna Summer. Disco absolutely dominated the music charts and pop culture in the 1970s. It was a flashy era of dance music, spotlighting stars like the Bee Gees with Stayin' Alive, Donna Summer's Last Dance, and the Saturday Night Fever soundtrack. Disco fashion featured shiny fabrics, platform shoes, and sequins. Nightclubs opened with dance floors and disco balls. Some even had lights built into the floors. Disco was king, and pop, rock, and R&B artists eventually adopted disco sounds to stay relevant. But not everyone was a fan of disco music. Infamously, some rock fans held disco demolition night rallies to offload disco records. Despite some backlash, disco left an indelible mark on 70s culture. Almost 50 years later, disco songs still get people dancing. Major gas shortages meant long lines at gas stations and fuel rationing in the US in the first half of the 70s. In 1973, an oil embargo led gas prices to skyrocket and caused nationwide shortages. Odd-even rationing limited people to buying gas on odd or even days based on their license plate number. Long lines of cars waiting at the pump were a common sight. Some gas stations had to close entirely once their allotted fuel ran out each day. The shortages caused problems for daily travel, businesses, and the economy. Though the 1970s oil crisis eventually ended, it left Americans with lasting memories of gas lines and the vulnerability of depending on foreign oil. For today's drivers who can easily fill up their tank anytime, it may be hard to imagine such a disruption to fuel supply ever happening. The floppy disk was invented in the early 1970s, revolutionizing data storage before larger capacity hard disks became available. Floppy disks were thin, flexible squares of coated plastic that could store data magnetically. The 5.2 5-inch disks became commercially available first, with the 3.5-inch version arriving later. Booting up computers from a floppy disk and storing files on diskettes became standard before CDs and USB drives took over. It's wild to think that a flimsy magnetic floppy disk could hold entire programs and documents. Today, we expect even small thumb drives to have 64 gigabytes or more. So while floppy disks marked a huge data storage improvement for 1970s technology, they definitely seem primitive now. The first manned NASA space shuttle missions launched in the 1970s, introducing a new era of space exploration. The Space Shuttle program began in 1972 and resulted in 5 fully operational shuttles: Columbia, Challenger, Discovery, Atlantis, and Endeavour. Historic missions carried astronauts into orbit, launched and repaired satellites, conducted science experiments, and helped build the International Space Station. Notable firsts included Sally Ride, becoming the first American woman in space in 1983. Before the shuttle, astronauts could only fly in single-use capsules. The reusable space shuttle fleet enabled new achievements over the last decades of the 20th century. Seeing them blast off was an inspiring display of scientific innovation. The 1970s marked the start of the space shuttle era that would define modern spaceflight. Home video game consoles like Atari's Pong and the Magnavox Odyssey brought gaming into living rooms in the 1970s. Their simple 2D graphics were cutting edge at the time. The arcade game revolution also began with sprites like Pong and Space Invaders. While unsophisticated compared to today's photorealistic games, 70s classics like Pac-Man and Asteroids gobbled up quarters and spawned franchises still popular today. The 1970s marked the introduction of video games as mainstream home entertainment. Gamers went from crowded, noisy arcades to being able to play for hours right in their rec rooms. And companies that got their start in the 70s, like Atari and Nintendo, would go on to define the industry. Hard to imagine a world without gaming, isn't it? The Watergate scandal and President Nixon's resignation rocked American politics in the early 1970s. It was a pivotal time that destroyed trust in leadership. The June 1972 break-in at the Watergate office complex in D.C. and subsequent cover-up attempts led to a lengthy scandal. Investigations revealed abuses of power by Nixon's administration. Nixon resisted handing over evidence and came under fire for obstruction of justice. But the release of incriminating tapes eventually caused him to resign rather than face near-certain impeachment. For the American public, the lies and corruption at the highest level marked a profound loss of innocence. Watergate remains synonymous with scandal. The 70s crisis shook confidence in the presidency for generations to come. The 3 Mile Island nuclear accident in 1979 was the most serious commercial power plant failure in U.S. history. The partial meltdown at the Pennsylvania plant resulted in a small release of radioactive gas. Thankfully, no deaths or injuries were reported, but the incident increased public fears about the risks of nuclear energy. It revealed inadequate emergency response preparation and worsened distrust in authorities after Watergate. The 3 Mile Island crisis catalyzed the decline of new nuclear plant construction in America. No new nuclear licenses were approved for decades after. The frightening event remains a defining cautionary tale about nuclear safety. For those living near the plant and beyond, it shattered confidence in nuclear energy and government oversight. So while some can learn about and imagine the 1970s, there are many things they will never get to truly experience from that decade. What are some quintessential 70s things that those that were born later missed out on? Let me know in the comments, and as always, thank you for watching.